Hi everyone, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. It's been a while since I've made a video. This is my spring break and my kids are at daycare and my car is at the shop and it's gonna be $1 million more just like it was last time. My 2013 Honda just continuing to cost me money constantly, so I'm kind of stressed out today. There were a lot of things that I needed to get done, but I just wanted to do something that has always been fun for me. I enjoy the process of filming YouTube videos and I like editing them and I like reading your comments and talking to you guys in the comments. So I'm just doing this video kind of for old time's sake, just to have something fun to do today and take my mind off of all the stress. And reading is another thing that I do just to kind of take my mind off of the stress of everyday life. I don't know how many updates I've given this school year, but this year I'm teaching 7 periods back to back to back to back to back every single day. I have 6th grade history, 7th grade English, and 8th grade English, so it's a lot to prepare and grade, and I have like around 250 students, and I have no prep time at all, and then I have 2 kids that I have to get ready for school and take to school every morning and pick up and take home and take to all their different things and feed and bathe and put to bed and do homework with and everything. So this year has just been exceptionally stressful, and when I get overwhelmed I read. I can just be in a room with my kids while they're doing whatever they are doing, and I can't really like concentrate on anything that takes too much, you know, like concentration on my laptop, like grading or planning or working on lessons or whatever, but I can kind of, you know, just look up and down from a book and, you know, concentrate enough on that. So I have been doing a lot of reading lately, and I really love historical fiction. Been reading a lot of historical fiction. It's been a couple years since I taught 8th grade English and did it again this year. And one of the things that I really liked last time I taught 8th grade English was reading the Diary of Anne Frank together as a group. Like, that's in our textbook. I think it's in most 8th grade English textbooks because the students are like the same age as Anne, and it's just a really powerful text to read, something written by someone your age. But the scope of it is really narrow. Like, the whole situation surrounding Anne Frank brings up a lot of questions, and for California 8th graders anyway, they haven't done World War II history like in class yet. Like, they won't do that until high school, like 10th or 11th grade. So there's a lot of basic things about World War II that they don't really know yet. So as you're teaching the Diary of Anne Frank, usually you get into like a little bit of the historical context and everything. By the way, if you are teaching the Diary of Anne Frank, one thing that I really love that we do is a justice journal where we go through the social justice standards as we read that text, and we watch Swing Kids. So I have separate videos on that you can watch on this channel. But one thing that I really like to do after we read something together as a group is then kind of do like book clubs where they're all set during World War II, but they can be set anywhere on Earth. Like, the book doesn't matter as long as it's set during World War II. And so I find this to be a really cool way to just like allow students to read a little bit more about what they're interested in. And then because they're sharing about what's happening in their books, students are getting a much wider view of what World War II was like all around the world. Because I know when I was in high school and kind of at least the beginning of college, like, it didn't register to me that like World War II was also happening in Asia. Like, learning about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and stuff didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because I just didn't really understand what was happening in Japan besides like Pearl Harbor. So allowing students to read like a really wide variety of World War II historical fiction has been very cool. And I find that that also tends to be like the first topic that kind of entices students into reading historical fiction. It is by nature just very like alarming, kind of epic in some ways. So anyways, I put together 50 recommendations, historical fiction set during World War II, book recommendations for my 8th graders. So some of these books are a little bit more appropriate for like high schoolers, or just, you know, your kind of more mature readers in like 8th grade or middle school. Some of them are, you know, just very much middle grades, and then others just have a lower reading level, because I still have students in 8th grade whose reading level is more like 2nd or 3rd grade. So I did have options like Number the Stars or Sylvia and Aki, where the reading level is going to be more accessible for them. But then I have other students who are like really ready to learn more about this topic and read about it from a bit more of like an adult perspective. So this has a mix, and there are little, you know, indicators letting you know if it's a book that's technically, you know, meant for adults. So you can kind of decide like what's most appropriate for your students. And I always find that like reading history or reading historical fiction just leads me to do more and more reading, because there's like another little thread that I see that I'm like, oh, let me check this out, let me check this out. Hello, neighbors, leaf blower. We're just gonna have to deal. Anyway, that is on Teachers Pay Teachers, and it comes with like discussion questions and like information about each section of the world and like how they were involved in World War II. Eastern Europe, France, Germany, Poland, like all of those places had really, really different relationships to the war, plus the United States. And I also have a whole section of like Japanese American perspectives from the United States, because that's very different from just a US perspective generally. And then I have Asia, you know, China was being invaded by Japan, and Korea was colonized by Japan. I have a book, I just got this one that's set in the Philippines, and I was just reading this book, which is freaking mind-blowing, How to Hide an Empire. And I learned so much about the war in the Philippines, which was US soil at that time, and we never learn about that. This one's called When We Had Wings by Ariel Lawhon, Christina McMorris, and Susan Meissner. I feel like I've read some of Susan Meissner's, and I just read a different one by Ariel Lawhon. How do you say that last name? Lawhon? I'll talk about that one in a second. And then I am also reading this one. This is An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro, who is a Nobel Prize winning author. I mean, this book won a Nobel Prize. And the thing that is so interesting about even just like looking for books that are set during World War II is that there's nothing from the perspective of Japanese people. So you have a lot of books that are set in Germany or in Poland, and there's often like a German kid or a German teenager, and maybe like at first they're kind of like swept up into the Nazi youth or whatever. They become a spy or something like that. Like usually there's some kind of like a redemption arc where they turn against the Nazis, or you just have these, you know, novels set in concentration camps and you see the Nazi soldiers. There is nothing written from the perspective of people who are fighting on the side of the Japanese. And I feel like this is really, really telling that this is not a conversation. This is not something we're writing about, or we're not publishing it, or we're not publishing it in English. So anyway, this one is set in the 50s. When is this one written? When did this win a Nobel Prize? Okay, oh, this was written in 1986. That's when I was born. But it's set just after World War II, when the Americans are really running everything in Japan. And if you want to know more about that, you can read more about that in this book. I'm like 68 pages in. Yeah, it's not a long book, but I'm like a third of the way through. But this artist, I think, probably worked on the side of the Japanese Empire during the war. Everything is very like nebulous right now. They won't really say. what has been happening over the past couple of years. But he also wrote The Remains of the Day, which I'm going to read next, but I have seen the movie because of the extra scene in Waiting for Guffman where he has like Remains of the Day lunch boxes. But that movie is actually really, really amazing, and it's very similar because it's set in England just after World War II. And it also deals with British people who actually had supported Nazis, you know, just a few years earlier, and like what the fallout is like for them. And so Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Japan but moved to England. And so I think it'd be really interesting to read these two side by side. I think that's what he meant to do. I don't know a whole lot about him. I'm like very, very interested in him as a writer now because of like what he's setting up here. He's writing about these people who kind of benefited from the war monetarily in Japan in this book, in Artists of the Floating World, and then in England in The Remains of the Day. So I'm just like very interested in doing a little comparison there. Let's look though at all these books that I've been reading. I have been much more active on Goodreads lately. I have read 20 books. My goal was 40. I'll just leave it for now. I'm gonna skip anything that's not historical fiction. So the first historical fiction that I read this year is really different. It's called The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. And it's set in this Norwegian village in the 1600s. And it has a lot to do with like the church, kind of like missionaries, butting heads with just like the indigenous people there and their beliefs. And like what happens at the very beginning is all the men in this little village go out on a fishing trip, and there's a huge storm that just sinks the boat. And so then it's only women left on this island, and they like watch the boat go down. And so for a little while, it's kind of like lovely on the island or in this little village, and the women just like run everything. But then the church decides to like send in these people to oversee the village and try to determine whether or not it was like witchcraft that took down the boat. And it's just very interesting. I've been trying to read, you know, books set all over the world and in all different time periods. And so this one was really unique and very good. I highly recommend that one. The next one that's more historical fiction-y is Shanghai Girls. This is by Lisa C. So this one is on like my list of recommendations for World War II historical fiction. 3 of my 8th graders read this one actually. So it's set obviously in Shanghai, at least at the beginning, in the 40s. And there's these 2 sisters, and they're called Beautiful Girls, and they're basically like Instagram influencers. Like they go to this guy's house all the time, and he's like a photographer, but he paints them and does like all these different ads for different like clothing and just products and stuff. And so there are like different seasonal like calendars that they are on. Like they're the Beautiful Girls on these calendars. So they are kind of like upper class, but it turns out their dad has been gambling with a lot of their money, and that happens like at the same time as the Japanese invade. A lot of things happen, and then they eventually flee to Angel Island. They're there for quite a while, so you get this history of like immigration at Angel Island, and then they are eventually in Los Angeles. But this all occurs because they are trying to flee from the Japanese in China. So that one's really interesting. I read the sequel after that. Let me get up to that. Okay, so the next historical fiction one that I read, this is definitely more like middle grades. I wanted to have some familiarity with some of these newer middle grades books. The War That Saved My Life. I've seen this one like on Instagram and stuff a lot. It's by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, and it is really good. It's set in London, and the main character is a girl who has a club foot, so she is disabled. Her mom won't let her out of their little apartment. They're poor, they live in London. So when like the air raids start happening and people start sending their kids out to the countryside, this girl is like excited because she gets to get away from her mom and her horrible life. So her and her brother are sent out to the countryside, and it's just a different look at World War II from the perspective of, you know, like kids in England. And the one interesting thing about that too is, you know, the kids in like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's why they are sent off into the countryside. That was the setup for that story too. So I just find that interesting. It's very good. It's very sad, but I definitely recommend it for like a middle grade historical fiction novel. I think it's really good. And then I went ahead and read the sequel, which is The War I Finally Won, and it just continues the story. The war is still going on. They end up having a Jewish German refugee in their house, and they don't trust her because she's German, but she had to flee Germany because she's Jewish. And so these people in England kind of don't like understand. They don't see the nuance here. They just like don't trust her because she's German, and she's like, clearly I'm not German enough because that's why I have fled here. So yeah, it's just so good. I really liked these two books. Oh my gosh, we'll have to talk about this later, but I also read Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich by Norman Ohler. It's not historical fiction, it's just history. Oh my gosh, read that one. We'll have to talk. I read quite a few like history books this year too, so we'll have to talk about those as well. Let's do a whole nother video on that. And then I read The Frozen River, and this is the one by Ariel Lawhon. I picked this up because it is about the life of Martha Ballard, and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich wrote an amazing just like historical monograph about her diary that we have from, it's like the late 1700s, like the colonial period in America. It's Massachusetts, Maine area, and she was a midwife. So A Midwife's Tale is the Laurel Thatcher Ulrich one. That's like a staple, amazing historical text that anybody who's doing, you know, a history degree or a master's in history or something would read. So it was cool to see like a historical fiction version of it. So I liked that one. Okay, I would rather just read the straight up history, but I like that. Under the Broken Sky was the closest thing that I could find to any World War II history from the perspective of somebody who's Japanese. And this, all of this is something I just did not know. So there were Japanese settlers in Manchuria, and that's the main characters here. In this story, it's like these two girls, their mom passed away during childbirth, so they just live with their dad. Their dad gets conscripted into the Japanese army. He's got to go fight. They don't even know who he's going to fight. Like, is he fighting the Soviets? Is he fighting the Chinese or the Manchurians, or have the Americans come yet? They don't really know. They don't really have access to very much information. So it's just like women and children and the elderly left. It actually is the Soviets that invade, and they have to like just walk until they can find somewhere safe to stop. But they're walking into China, and China is at war with Japan, and these people, even though some of them have never been to Japan, are Japanese. They're speaking in Japanese, and it's just like not safe for them anywhere. This is a novel in verse, and it's just about a topic that I had no idea about, so I highly recommend this one too. Good for middle school, high school, adults, whatever. It's just interesting. Then I read An American Beauty by Shana Abe. This one's not a World War II book, but this is like a Gilded Age historical fiction novel, and the reason I wanted to read it is because I go to the Huntington Library a lot. I work with their like teacher educator panel over there, and I'm just like fascinated by all the historical like artifacts and art and books and everything that they have at the Huntington Library. And this book is about Arabella Huntington, whose property that was, and she was born in the South during the Civil War. She meets Collis Huntington essentially at like the brothel where she works, and she ends up being like his side chick until his wife dies, and then she marries him, and then he dies, and then she marries his nephew, and she just like gains all this wealth through doing that. Like, she was kind of impressive. I mean, she was impressive. Yeah, and then she ends up owning, you know, with her husband, the Huntington Library, which is huge. It's enormous. If you've never been there, you should definitely go there. If you ever come to like Southern California on vacation or something, go to the Huntington Gardens, because it's like just amazing. And they left it behind, I suppose, as a panel of trustees or something, but it's open to the public. You just, you know, pay to get in. But yeah, it's wild. This was a wild story. Then I read what everybody else read, The Women by Kristen Hanna, and I liked it. It is about women who were nurses during the Vietnam War and were overlooked, like, even in their time. Like, even when they came back to the US after serving, they couldn't get like mental health services and stuff like that from the VA, because the VA is like, oh, you weren't in Vietnam. And they're like, yes, we were. And they're like, well, you weren't in combat. And they're like, well, we were. Like, we were being shot at and bombed out, and while we're like trying to save people's lives, like, yes, we were. So it's split pretty much half and half between, like, you know, the first half is all in Vietnam and just like the absolute horrors of this awful, stupid war. And then the other half is like when this girl, Frankie, as she comes home and like just tries to like put her life together after this. She's only like in her early 20s, as a lot of these soldiers would have been. You know, they went there very young and then came back and tried to figure out what to do with all this PTSD and everything. And it does show how so many men died, and, you know, they were disproportionately Black, Mexican, Native American, and very young. And that's mostly who we were sending, is just these poor boys of color for the most part. So it does, you know, get into that just within the plot. I mean, Kristen Hanna writes in kind of a cheesy way. Like, she doesn't have like my favorite writing style, but she's a popular author and a lot of people have read this book. And so I think that's important that so many more of us now like have a better perspective of what happened during the Vietnam War and like the reaction to it. And it just explains too a lot about like why so many of these people had such a hard time when they returned, and there was so few resources for them and just like such little compassion for them, because they were agents of a government that was making awful decisions, but they weren't really making those decisions, you know? So anyway, it's very good. It's, you know, quite complex. I really liked it. The only thing I wish she had included is how all of these returning veterans at that time kind of like merged with the disability rights movement, because so many men came back disabled. And it would have been cool if it had also just gone in that direction, but, you know, it was very long. So maybe another novel. Then I read Dreams of Joy, which is the Shanghai Girls sequel. And Joy is the worst. She's the daughter in the first book, and then she like goes to college and decides that China during Mao's regime is her true home, and she runs away to freaking China because she's an idiot, and her mom has to follow her, and she is enthralled by Mao. She goes to the countryside to teach the peasants art and like falls in love with this dumb guy there. Like it's about the Great Leap Forward. Like, that's, you know, that's coming as you're reading all of this, and you're just like, no. I don't know how much you've read about the Great Leap Forward, but it was awful, and just the stupidity of Mao. Just like, let's get rid of all the freaking sparrows, but also all the bugs, as if sparrows don't eat bugs. Let's like burn metal in our backyards. Let's pick as many crops as we can in 24 hours. Just these stupid ideas that led to mass death, mass starvation, mass suffering. And no one was allowed to speak out about it until they eventually do. Actually, you know what I want to reread again? Reread again. Little Gods. I just remember reading this a long time ago, before I knew very much about Chinese history, and like this kind of unlocked a lot of questions in me, and now I would have a much better like sense of what's going on. So I think I'm gonna reread this one. I think that was the first book I ever read for Amory's book club, or one of the first. So it was such a cool cover too. So anyway, God, that book was so stressful. Dreams of Joy. I just wanted to wring her neck. The House on Mango Street, that doesn't really count as historical fiction. Bandit Queens. Okay, Across So Many Seas. This one is very interesting. Ruth Behar. She also wrote like Letters to Cuba, which was another option for my kids to read. But there were so few others, because like this girl is escaping Russia, Poland, one of those, and her father go to Cuba. So they're Jewish. And so in this book, it expands that even more. So it begins in 1492, which is the year that Jews are expelled from Spain. So you have this family who has to leave Spain. They go to Italy for a little while, and then they go to Turkey. And then we fast forward a few centuries, and you have this Jewish family that like speaks Spanish, kind of has like Spanish names, but they live in Turkey. And one of the daughters is sent to Cuba again. Oh yeah, yes, Cuba again. So there she is in Cuba. She speaks Spanish. Oh, and then we move down a couple generations again. I've been reading a lot. It's getting mixed up in my brain. But okay, so then there's another girl. We're following the stories of like all these different generations. So we have this other girl, I think, and she is a young person when Fidel comes to power. And similar to Joy, she gets very caught up in this, and she also goes to the countryside to teach peasants how to read. There's a lot of this, gotta send away any of our like educated or talented people who know anything about the world to the countryside. And then they eventually, like, they have to flee to Miami. And then they, it kind of all comes together. They go on a family trip back to Spain to see where their family came from, you know, centuries ago. So it's really good. It's very much a middle grades book. Like the dialogue is, some of the descriptions are just like so cheesy. Like I love books that are middle grades, like The Time of Green Magic, and like they are at a lower reading level, but like you never get the sense that, I don't know, every single sentence is not like super well done and like as complex and gorgeous as it can possibly be while still, you know, being accessible to young readers. I love a book like that. They're really few and far between. So this one, it's on the cheesy and annoying side, but like the overall plot I think is really good and really interesting. And then yeah, that brings me to just what I am reading now, which, you know, this is one of the best books ever. And it's really not like chronological or anything, but it has a lot of World War II in it. And then currently reading this one that's just like post World War II, but we're gonna learn a little bit more about Japan during World War II through this, I think. And then this one is set in the Philippines during World War II. So there's just endless learning to be done. Even on a single topic, even just on World War II, you could read all 50 of those books and still have so many questions. And so I think this is one, not really trick, but like strategy to get your students to read more, is if they are aware that like, okay, I'm just reading one little tiny piece of this story and there are so many other stories, and if I have questions when I'm done with this book, I could get some of those questions answered by some of these over here. And you know, sometimes people will critique a book on a certain topic and say that it didn't include every possible situation, and I'm like, well, read another book then that does consider that situation and include that. So as usual, my battery is about to die, but thank you for just talking books with me today. If you're interested in that like 50 book resource thing, I will link it down below, and I'm gonna go continue to read this for a little while today. So I will see you guys soon, hopefully. I hope you had or are having a great spring break, and I'll see you soon. Bye.